Daniel Carter never expected a simple walk home to change his life. It was a quiet evening, the sun setting behind the tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge, an affluent neighborhood known for its pristine lawns and towering mansions. Daniel, a 19-year-old college student, had just left his friend's house and was making his way toward the bus stop. He kept his hood down, his hands in his pockets and his steps measured. He knew how people in neighborhoods like this looked at people like him. He didn't see the patrol car creeping up behind him until red and blue lights flashed, cutting through the dusk. "Hands where I can see them," a voice barked. Two officers stepped out, their hands hovering over their holsters. Daniel froze, confusion twisting in his gut. I'm just heading home," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Got a call about a suspicious person in the area," the officer on the left said, sizing him up. Daniel swallowed hard. "Suspicious how?" The second officer ignored him. "ID, now." He reached for his wallet slowly, but it didn't matter. In seconds he was in handcuffs, shoved against the car. Daniel's protest fell on deaf ears. Tonight he was guilty of only one thing, being in the wrong neighborhood. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Daniel's wrists as he sat in the back of the police car. His mind raced, replaying the arrest over and over. He had done nothing wrong. He had no weapons, no stolen goods, just a college ID and a backpack full of textbooks. But none of that mattered. The officers didn't speak to him during the ride to the station. They didn't explain why he was being detained. They didn't even look at him. When they reached the station, Daniel was processed like a criminal, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. The other men inside gave him weary glances, some nodding in understanding. He wasn't the first young black man to end up here for no reason, and he wouldn't be the last. Hours passed before a stern-faced officer finally unlocked the cell. "You're free to go," he said as if it were a favor. No apology. No explanation. Just a release into the cold night. Daniel's mother was waiting outside, her eyes red-rimmed from worry. As they walked home she whispered, "This isn't right." He knew she was right. And he knew he couldn't let this go. This wasn't just a bad night. It was the start of something bigger. The days after the arrest were heavy with silence. Daniel's mind replayed every second, how they sized him up, how they refused to hear his voice. The bruises on his wrists faded, but the humiliation burned deeper. The worst part was how quickly the world moved on as if nothing had happened. His mother watched him closely, her heart aching at the sight of her once-spirited son growing more distant. "Daniel, you can't carry this anger alone," she said one evening, her voice gentle. "Talk to someone." Instead of breaking, Daniel buried himself in his books, particularly his criminal justice textbooks. He read about cases like his, stories of men wrongfully arrested, families torn apart, and justice denied. The more he learned, the more his anger sharpened into something stronger, purpose. One afternoon his professor, Mr. Reynolds, noticed the change. After class he pulled Daniel aside. "I see it in your eyes," he said. "You're searching for answers. But what are you going to do with them?" Daniel clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. "I'm going to change the system from the inside." Mr. Reynolds smiled faintly. "Then start by understanding it. Let knowledge be your weapon." From that moment on, Daniel's path was set. Every insult, every injustice, he would use it to fuel his rise. Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration, but for Daniel, it felt like the first battle. Clad in his navy blue gown, he shook hands with professors and posed for photos with his mother. Yet his mind was already racing ahead to what came next, the police academy. When he told his friends about his decision, they were stunned. "You want to become a cop? After what they did to you?" Malik, his childhood friend, asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "If I don't do it, who will?" His mother was proud but afraid. Every time he left the house, her eyes lingered on him a little longer, as if silently praying he'd come back safe. "You're walking into the lion's den," she warned. "I know," Daniel replied softly. "But maybe the lions need to learn they're not the kings." The academy was harder than he expected, not because of the physical demands but the quiet hostility. Some instructors barely hid their disdain. A few recruits muttered slurs under their breath. But Daniel absorbed every lesson, every law, and every tactic. He wasn't just there to pass, he was there to outshine them all. By the time the final exams came, Daniel ranked in the top 5 of his class. He pinned on his badge with pride, but he knew the real fight was only just beginning. Daniel's first day as an officer was met with cold stares and forced handshakes. He could feel the unspoken challenge in the air. Some of his fellow officers doubted him, while others saw him as a traitor. The ones who had been at the academy with him had already written him off. As he stepped into the precinct, Officer Mitchell, a grizzled veteran with years on the force, smirked. Well, the kid who thinks he's gonna fix the world. Let's see how long you last." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make a difference. His first few weeks on the job were a test of patience. Partnered with Officer Grayson, a no-nonsense cop who rarely spoke, Daniel patrolled the same streets where he had once been arrested. The irony wasn't lost on him. One afternoon, a call came through. A young black teen had been stopped for looking suspicious. Daniel's stomach twisted. This was too familiar. When they arrived, Daniel saw the fear in the boy's eyes. The officers who stopped him were questioning him aggressively. Daniel stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "What's the charge?" The older officer scoffed. "He was wandering around this neighborhood. Didn't look like he belonged." Daniel clenched his jaw. "That's not a crime." He turned to the teen and asked for his ID, handling the situation with professionalism. Within minutes, the boy was let go. Back at the station, Officer Grayson studied Daniel for a moment. "You really think you can change things?" Daniel met his gaze. "I have to try." Months passed, and Daniel became known as the cop who didn't look the other way. He followed the rules, but more importantly, he upheld justice. Not everyone appreciated that. One night, he and Grayson responded to a domestic disturbance call in a rough neighborhood. When they arrived, Daniel spotted two other officers, Reeves and Connors, already on the scene. Something about their stance, the way they loomed over a trembling man on his knees, sent a warning through his gut. As Daniel approached, he saw the man's face, battered and bruised. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice even. Reeves shot him a glare. "This guy resisted. Had to teach him a lesson." Daniel's fists tightened. The man was barely conscious. "We're supposed to arrest criminals, not beat them down." Connors smirked. "Welcome to the real world, rookie." Grayson stayed silent, watching. Daniel knew he had a choice: speak up and make enemies or stay quiet and be complicit. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his notepad. "We'll need to file a report on this." Reeves stepped forward, his voice low. "You sure you want to do that, Carter?" Daniel didn't waver. "Yeah, I do." The tension was thick, but Daniel refused to back down. He was here to change the system, even if it meant going against his own. The next morning, Daniel submitted his report detailing the excessive force used by officers Reeves and Connors. He knew what would follow: retaliation, isolation, and possibly even threats. But he hadn't joined the force to be silent. Within hours, word spread through the precinct. Conversation stopped when he walked by. Officers who once nodded in greeting now turned away. Reeves and Connors didn't say a word, but their stares burned with silent warning. At lunch, Daniel sat alone, eating in silence until Officer Grayson slid into the seat across from him. "You've got guts," he said, stirring his coffee. Daniel raised a brow. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" Grayson shrugged. "Depends. Most guys wouldn't have done what you did." He leaned in slightly. "But be careful. Reeves and Connors? They're not just street thugs with badges. They have friends higher up." Daniel had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach tighten. "So what?" "I let it go." Grayson studied him. "No. You keep doing what you're doing. Just know, when you stand against the system pushes back." As Grayson walked away, Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't afraid of pushback. He just had to be ready for whatever came next. A few weeks later, Daniel was responding to a call about a suspected robbery in progress. He and Grayson were the closest unit, so they arrived first. The scene was chaotic. Sirens blared, people gathered, and a frantic store clerk pointed toward an alley. Daniel spotted the suspect, a young black man no older than 20, cowering behind a dumpster. His hands were up, shaking. "I didn't do anything." Daniel approached cautiously, keeping his tone measured. "Hey, let's talk. What's your name?" Before the suspect could answer, tires screeched behind them. Reeves and Connors stormed out of their patrol car, weapons drawn. "Get on the ground now." Reeves barked. Daniel stepped between them. "He's unarmed. Let's de-escalate." Connors shoved past him. "Get out of the way, Carter." The suspect panicked, turning to run. Reeves lunged, tackling him hard to the pavement. A sickening crack filled the air as the young man's face hit the concrete. Blood smeared across the ground. Daniel's stomach churned. This wasn't law enforcement. This was brutality. He grabbed Reeves by the shoulder. "That's enough." Reeves turned, his jaw clenched. "You think you're in charge? You're nothing, Carter." And if you keep running your mouth, you'll end up just like him. Daniel's pulse pounded. He had a choice: step back and let it go, or take the fight even higher. His decision was made. That night he sat at his desk, filing another report, one that would shake the department to its core. But this time he knew they wouldn't just ignore it. They'd come for him. The morning after filing his report, Daniel felt the shift in the atmosphere the moment he walked into the precinct. Conversations hushed, eyes followed him, and a few officers exchanged knowing glances. It wasn't paranoia. Something was coming. An hour into his shift, he was called into the captain's office. Captain Briggs, a grizzled veteran who had spent decades navigating the politics of the force, sat behind his desk, arms crossed. "Carter," he said, his tone measured. "You filed a report against 2 senior officers. That's a serious accusation." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "Because it's true." Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get it. You want to change things. But there's a way we do things around here, and calling out fellow officers in official reports? That's not it." Daniel clenched his fists. "So what? We just let them get away with it." Briggs leaned forward. "I'm telling you to be smart. You think you're the first one to try and fix the system? You know what happens to guys who push too hard." Daniel already knew: transfers, demotions, or worse. But he wouldn't back down. "With all due respect, Captain, I didn't sign up to turn a blind eye." Briggs studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Then watch your back, Carter. Because they're already watching you." As Daniel left the office, his resolve hardened. The fight wasn't just about a corrupt few, it was about a system that allowed them to thrive. And if they were coming for him, he'd be ready. A week later, Daniel was assigned a routine patrol shift, except nothing about it felt routine. His partner for the night was Officer Connors. The moment they got into the car, Connors smirked. "Just you and me tonight, Carter. Should be interesting." Daniel ignored the bait, focusing on the radio chatter. But he stayed alert. Connors wasn't the type to let things go. An hour into their shift, a call came in, an alleged drug deal in progress near an abandoned lot. Connors grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. We're on it." He glanced at Daniel. "Let's go." Something felt off. The location was known for crime, but the call had come in too perfectly, like a trap waiting to spring. When they arrived, the lot was deserted except for one parked car. The moment Daniel stepped out, he heard it: a gunshot. Instinct took over. He ducked behind the patrol car, heart pounding. Then he saw Connors, his gun still raised, a smug look on his face. "Looks like you just walked into a bad situation, Carter," Connors said coolly. "Unregistered firearm, fleeing suspect. I wonder who they'll blame." Daniel's blood ran cold. This wasn't just retaliation. This was a setup. The system wasn't just resisting change, it was trying to destroy him. But they underestimated him. Daniel reached for his radio. "Dispatch, officer involved shooting. Requesting backup. And send internal affairs." Connor's smirk faded. Daniel had just flipped the script. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup arrived, along with internal affairs. Daniel kept his hands visible, his pulse steady despite the tension. He had seen how these situations played out before, how stories could be twisted, how evidence could mysteriously disappear. But he wasn't going to let that happen this time. Officer Connor stepped back, slipping into character with a practiced ease. "Carter and I responded to a suspicious activity call. Suspect fired a shot and ran. Carter returned fire." He gestured toward Daniel. "Right, partner?" Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. "That's a lie." Murmurs spread through the officers. One of the IA agents, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Morales, stepped forward. "Let's check the body cams." Connors tensed. Daniel's heart pounded. He had activated his body cam the moment they arrived, just in case. If everything recorded properly, the truth would be clear. Minutes passed as Morales reviewed the footage. Then she looked up. "Officer Connors, please hand over your firearm." Connors paled. "This is ridiculous." Morales didn't blink. "We have footage of you discharging your weapon without provocation. You'll be placed on administrative leave pending investigation." The officers exchanged glances. Connors, a seasoned cop, was now being treated like a suspect. For the first time, Daniel saw fear in his eyes. As Connors was led away, Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't naive, this wasn't the end. But it was proof that change was possible. One corrupt officer down. The real battle, however, was just beginning. The next morning, Daniel walked into the precinct knowing he had made enemies. The silence in the locker room was heavier than usual. A few officers wouldn't meet his eyes. Others glared openly. As he reached his locker, he found something taped to the door, a playing card. The ace of spades. A warning. He took it down, his fingers tightening. This was a message: back off or else. Rough night? A voice came from behind. It was Officer Reynolds, one of the few colleagues Daniel halfway trusted. Daniel held up the card. Looks like some people didn't like what happened last night. Reynolds sighed. Carter, you just took down a senior officer. The old guard isn't gonna let that slide. I'm not here to make friends, Daniel said firmly. I'm here to make things right. Reynolds gave him a long look before nodding. Then watch your back. Because this fight isn't over. Daniel already knew that. And he wasn't backing down. The tension in the precinct thickened with each passing day. Some officers were outwardly hostile, while others simply avoided Daniel altogether. But he kept his head down, focusing on his job. He had come too far to be intimidated now. Then it happened. One evening, as Daniel was finishing up paperwork, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. Check your locker before you leave. His pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. Walking casually to the locker room, he opened his locker and froze. Inside, tucked between his personal belongings, was a small bag of white powder. Drugs. A setup. Footsteps approached. Carter. A gruff voice called out. He turned to see Captain Dawson and two internal affairs officers standing at the entrance. Daniel exhaled slowly. They wanted to take him down the same way they had taken down countless innocent people, by planting evidence. But they had underestimated him. He stepped back and crossed his arms. Check the security cameras, he said calmly. Unless you're afraid of what they'll show. Dawson's expression darkened. The IA officers exchanged glances. Fine, one of them said. Let's take a look. Daniel knew he had just called their bluff. Now it was a battle of who would crack first. The security footage revealed everything. A shadowy figure, face hidden under a cap, was seen stuffing something into Daniel's locker just moments before the anonymous message had been sent. The IA officers had no choice but to drop the case. But the damage was done. The corruption in the department wasn't just about a few bad cops. It was a deeply rooted system protecting its own. Later that night, as Daniel sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number, you got lucky. Next time you won't. He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had expected pushback, but now it was personal. The department wanted him gone. He had two choices: walk away and stay safe, or fight back and risk everything. Daniel made his decision. The next morning, he walked into the mayor's office with a file in hand. A file containing everything he had uncovered. Evidence of corruption, false arrests, planted evidence, and excessive force. If you want real change, he said, placing the file on the desk, it starts here. The mayor studied him, then the file. Finally she nodded. Let's talk. This was it. The moment Daniel had been working toward. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time he had real power on his side. Months passed, and the city saw a reckoning unlike anything before. Several officers were fired. Internal affairs investigations led to arrests. Policies were rewritten. And the department faced an overhaul from the top down. Then came the final, unexpected decision. At a press conference, the mayor stood before the cameras and made the announcement that stunned the city. Effective immediately, Daniel Carter will be the new police commissioner. The room erupted. Daniel, now dressed in his new uniform, stepped up to the podium. He looked out at the crowd, at the officers who hated him, at the citizens who had lost trust in law enforcement, at the young men like him who had once been unjustly targeted. He took a deep breath and spoke. We've seen what happens when power is abused. We've seen what happens when justice is denied. But today we start a new chapter. One where accountability isn't just a word, it's a promise. Applause rang out. Some officers remained stone-faced, but others nodded in quiet acceptance. Change had come and there was no turning back. As Daniel stepped away from the podium, he knew his fight wasn't over. But this time he wasn't just another man trying to survive a broken system. He was the system now. And he was going to make it right.